Good evening, everyone. This is Clare Lopez, Lopez Liberty LLC. Thanks for joining us tonight for this edition of Sharia Crime Stoppers, a project of the United West. Tonight, I wanted to pick up on a theme that I had talked about earlier and also hit a couple of other news items for you, just to show that there really is a rest of the world still going on out there. But I want to begin with a theme, as I said, that I've talked about before on earlier programs, that has to do with something that President Trump has said. You'll remember, he said, we cannot let the cure be worse than the virus itself, or something to that effect, right? And what he meant by that was the shutdown of the US economy. That is a necessary accompaniment, if you will, to our need individually to remain at home as much as possible and to avoid mixing and mingling with other people in ways that could spread the virus. But I want to pick up that theme in a slightly different way, and that is to talk about how we, the citizens, we, the people of the United States, how and to what extent we are willing to cede our individual liberty and our rights guaranteed under the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. Now, as the testing for the coronavirus becomes way more extensive, much ramped up here in the United States. I just heard the president say this afternoon that we here in the United States have conducted more tests now than any other country in the world. But as those numbers go up, and unfortunately, as the numbers of positive cases go up, and even more unfortunately, as the numbers of deaths continue to rise, the overall ratio, percentage of mortality is indeed going down. The president hopefully told us that by about 2 more weeks, unfortunately, that will be right about Easter Sunday and Passover weekend, that probably will be the peak of the infection here in the United States, based on modeling and trends as we're looking at them right now. Hopeful things that I wanted to mention, the US Navy ships, the Mercy has just docked in Los Angeles Harbor, and the US Navy ship, the Comfort, has just arrived today earlier in New York City. And those ships are both there with hundreds upon hundreds of beds, stocked with massive amounts of supplies and equipment. But those are there to take care of non-coronavirus patients in Los Angeles and New York, so that the onshore facilities at hospitals in those two coastal cities can be dedicated to the coronavirus victims. And so I think the way that the president and his White House task force team, led by Vice President Mike Pence, the way that they have coordinated not just these government resources like these Navy ships, but the coordination, the cooperation, the collaboration of all these private companies that have not needed arm twisting or forcing, or the force of US law to compel them to step in, but that they have done this. They have been coordinated by the White House task force, Corona task force, but they've stepped up willingly. I think this is just an amazing testament to the American spirit, to our entrepreneurial spirit. And I think it's an indicator, I think we can take hope from this, that once this virus is vanquished, and it will be vanquished, the American economy will come roaring back. and we can expect that, I am hopeful, by the end of the summer and early fall. But now, here's the part that I'm getting to with picking up on those earlier themes of individual liberties and our constitutional rights, and that is that power once ceded to central authority, to the federal government here in this case, is rarely, if ever, given back. Now, I think all of us cheer President Trump for his defense of the nation state, the defense of our borders, against those who stand for globalism, the international world order, George Soros type of open borders, no borders. We cheer President Trump's defense of that nation state concept that goes all the way back to the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, which really established the concept in Western civilization of the sovereignty of the nation state, and that of course includes borders. But at the same time that we are standing with the president against these globalization notions that include communism, fascism, Japanese imperialism of the 20th century, and certainly Islam, we still, I think, must be vigilant. And I really don't know if this saying comes from Thomas Jefferson or not. There's some debate about it, but the quote, as it comes down to us in any case, is a good one. And that is that the cost of liberty is eternal vigilance. And so that's, I think, what I'm trying to emphasize here about how far we're going to be willing to go to cede to a central government the power over our individual liberties. Now, I think the president has done a really good job of treading that line, maintaining that division between the centralized power of the federal government and giving or allowing to the states, to the 50 states and the governors, the people thereof, the right to make decisions within the boundaries of each of those states. Now, unfortunately, it is precisely at the state and sometimes municipal levels during this crisis that we are seeing grabs for power and a shredding of constitutional rights. I think I mentioned a number of those to all of you who might have been watching last week. I'm going to mention a few things that we see going on in other countries that we really hope we never see here. I'll name China, of course, but also to some extent Israel. These two are using artificial intelligence technology, cell phone tracking, GPS geared cell phone tracking, and social media data mining to enforce quarantine lockdowns in those countries. Again, China and Israel, I'm naming here. I think these are places we don't really want to go, even though the technology is now becoming available to do that. In fact, private tech firms here in the United States are actually in discussions with the United States government on the use of just such technology, GPS, cell phone tracking, artificial intelligence, and so forth. Vigilance, I think, is my word for the night on this topic, vigilance. Now, the Department of Justice is reported to have requested additional powers, not granted to the best of my knowledge yet, for use in time of emergency. The power, for example, to pause constitutional processing, meaning pre-arrest, post-arrest, trial, the right to see a judge, to trial by jury. These things are reported. I don't believe they've gone into effect, but these are the kinds of things that we ought to be concerned about and vigilant about. The other thing that is concerning, I think, to many of us is the massive amount of federal debt that we are racking up. Whatever it was before, well over 20 trillion with a T dollars, was passed by both houses of Congress and signed by President Trump this past week, at the end of last week, for a total of $6.2 trillion. Our federal debt is beyond control at this point. Now, if this is just a bridge to control, to get past the COVID-19 pandemic, and that the trade-off is to save a massive multi-trillion dollar economy, maybe we take a deep breath and trust President Trump. Now, the other thing that President Trump is doing, and I'm of mixed mind about this, I welcome your thoughts and questions about it, perhaps at the end of the broadcast here. President Trump is essentially seizing control of the Federal Reserve, our central banking system, and placing that under the control of the federal government, the United States Treasury Department. Now, I know why he's doing it, and I know that for a long time he has thought that the Federal Reserve has not acted in the best interests of the United States economy, and that now placing it essentially, really, under the control of the US federal government and the Treasury Department allows the president, in this time of crisis, to make more decisions in financial areas. Let's see. Now, as far as federal quarantines go, again, as I said, it is largely the states and the municipalities which have this authority. The federal government is not going to go and order a nationwide quarantine, lockdown, martial law. Step away from the blogs, back away slowly from the blogs, okay? But at the same time, we do see, as I said, state and municipal leadership, as in New York City, Chicago, New Orleans, issuing orders at the state and municipal level that very much restrict constitutional rights and liberties granted under the Bill of Rights. Now, the US Constitution, Article 1, Section 8 is what's called the Commerce Clause. And this clause permits the federal level, that would be the president, to determine what goes on between states. In other words, the president could issue an order, he's not done this, but issue an order restricting travel between or among states, but not within states. That authority rests with the state level government, governor, legislature. So there is constitutional authority for restriction of movement nationwide between and among states. The president has not invoked this. Doesn't seem that he's going to either. Now the states, back to the state level again, they do, the governors of the states have the power to call out the National Guard. The president does have the exceptional power to call out the guards, plural, in several states, to nationalize the National Guard, but he's not done that. And so up until now, it is the states that have the authority and are and have been calling out their various National Guards. Now, more than, I think around a couple dozen at least, states now have called up their National Guards to help with things like maintaining order, maintaining guard over things like warehouse, distribution of emergency equipment and the like. But I think we all remember back in 2005 during the crisis of Hurricane Katrina in the state of Louisiana, and in particular in New Orleans, when the National Guard literally went house to house, seizing privately owned firearms. Now, that is the kind of thing I'm warning against. That is the kind of thing that we do not want to see. We don't want to see that repeated. Now, the states also have the authority to enforce isolation, the stay-at-home orders. My own state of Virginia apparently is going to issue such an order, taking place at midnight, well, 11:59 tomorrow night, that being Tuesday night, tomorrow night, in time of pandemic like now. The states also have the power to close down what we otherwise would have thought of as our First Amendment rights. For example, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, to include all kinds of gatherings, concerts, theaters, sports, houses of worship of all denominations, to close, but it has to be uniformly enforced. It cannot be pick and choose. I shut down this theater, but that sports arena can stay open. No, that is not the way it goes. They either have to be uniform in the shutdown of all of them, or none of them. And to the best of my knowledge so far, this is pretty much what's been happening. Now, let me just finish this particular theme here, talking about special powers in time when continuity of government might be in question in time of severe crisis. Now, this authority goes back to the Eisenhower administration of the 1950s and what's called the Insurrection Act. And really, the powers for ensuring the continuity of government, they really had to do, certainly back then, with fears of a nuclear attack. Remember the depths of the Cold War. This is the 1950s and the Eisenhower years. Invasion by an outside hostile foreign force, or literally insurrection, rebellion, armed insurrection within the country itself. That's what this was for. And it would allow for exception to be made to posse comitatus. That is about the use of the US military, not just the National Guard, but the US military within US borders. And I don't mean just for the defense of those borders, which is precisely what the military is for, but rather within the country as a whole. Now, what we're dealing with now is not an external invasion, except if you think of the virus as such, and we might, right? But of armed forces, an invasion of armed forces from without, nor is this a nuclear attack. It might be thought of as a biological warfare attack. I think of it that way. But in any case, we really have to think about these wartime, insurrection time powers that really go beyond the natural disaster events of a localized hurricane, tornado, fires, floods, and that sort of thing, or terrorism even. But this is nationwide. Yes, there are vast swaths of the country, throughout the middle of the country, that really are not much affected. Yes, every single state does have at least one case of coronavirus, COVID-19, I should say. But there are many states throughout the middle of the country that have very low numbers, in low, perhaps single or double digits. And they really don't have to be affected in the same way by measures like are being taken in New York City, for example, California, perhaps New Orleans, perhaps some other cities. So we really have to think, I mean, we're doing this on the fly in the middle of the coronavirus pandemic. But certainly when it's over and done, we at the citizen level and at every level of government, from local to regional, state, and federal, some real serious thought about how we want to handle these kinds of events in the future, because they will happen again. Pandemics will come again. All right, so let me just finally wrap up this part of tonight's discussion with you with what probably is necessary, and I think probably what President Trump is thinking about. He is extending the stay-at-home order through at least the end of April, 30th of April. But during that time, and certainly thereafter, I do believe he's considering regional or local differences, as I just talked about, in the spread, in the severity of the virus pandemic outbreak. And so in certain places, and perhaps on a staged, stepped kind of a plan, that the young and the healthy would be encouraged to go back to work, on-site work, not just at home work over the internet. But those at risk, those older, those with compromised immune systems or otherwise underlying health issues would remain at home and isolated. But those hot spots like New York, and as I've mentioned, other cities, New Orleans and other places, they may need to remain quarantined for a much longer period of time, unfortunately, than even the rest of the country, as I've just described, not so severely affected when the rest of the country gets back to more normal business. The final thought, and I'm sure this is on President Trump's mind, Larry Kudlow's mind, and others, is that all the liquidity and the cash being infused into the economy, and much needed right now for individuals as well as small businesses and large businesses too, industries like the airline industry, the cruise line industry, and so forth, restaurants and all of that, all the liquidity and the cash, being targeted their way will not matter in the end if we kill off entire sectors of the economy and they cannot get back to work within some matter of weeks. So let me stop there on that particular theme. There are two more themes I want to touch on tonight, and these lie beyond our borders. I think we need to consider that there are other things going on in the world that are critical, that we should be informed about, and that we will have to deal with after this domestic coronavirus crisis has abated, at least. The two things I want to touch on are the Turkish government's conflicts with Russia, in particular, involvement in Syria and in Libya. And then secondly, I want to talk a little bit more about where the Russia-Saudi Arabia oil price war is at this time. So as regards Turkey, we've talked before about the regime of President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, his AK party, that is the Justice and Development Party, his party that he helped to found. And they're very open and blatant references to the reestablishment of the Ottoman Empire by means of jihad. And these are not my words, they're the words of Erdogan and his senior officials, including from his Ministry of Defense. Now, I think we all realize that Turkey, for some time ago, sent thousands of troops, Turkish army troops, into provinces like Idlib province that used to be part of Syria, in order to carve out a zone of influence, and to ethnically cleanse, I'm going to use that term, ethnically cleanse Kurdish forces and civilians that had been there. So we know that Turkey had done that on the excuse that it had to secure its border areas against the Kurds. Well, it did that. It killed a lot of people. It ethnically cleansed a lot of Idlib province with the deaths of many Kurds in the process. Now, the other thing that Turkey has been doing, and by the way, this is aside from the verbal, blatant threats against places that used to be under the forcible conquest and domination of the Ottoman Empire, like Cyprus, like Greece, like the Balkans. But aside from that, I wanted to talk about something a little more recent, and this dates back really to just about the end of last year, around the November-December 2019 timeframe. And that is when Turkey, President Erdogan, decided to take thousands, as many as 4,000, maybe it's more now, fighters, jihadi fighters, from the Syrian battlefields. And these are not Turks. These are jihadi fighters with allegiance to Al-Qaeda, to Muslim Brotherhood militias, to the Islamic State, but up to and maybe more than 4,000 of these jihadi fighters, and transport them to Libya. They've done that. Turkey has already done that. I don't know how many more fighters may already be on the way en route. Now, you'll recall, of course, that under the Obama administration, there was a document which still remains classified to this day. So we don't really know what's in it, but it's called PSD-11, stands for Presidential Study Directive 11, as we understand it, issued about August of 2010, Obama administration, that outlines the blueprint of the Obama administration's policy plan for the Muslim Brotherhood. Now, we'll leave domestic aside and other areas aside for now, but talking about North Africa, what this document, to the best of our knowledge, and this is only because of leaks and people talking about it, we don't have the document or the wording itself. We do not have that. But from leaks, we come to the understanding that this document favored, supported the overthrow of strongman regimes, Ben Ali in Tunisia, Muammar Gaddafi in Libya, Hosni Mubarak in Egypt, supported their overthrow and replacement by the Muslim Brotherhood. Now, that's exactly what happened. One might say that Tunisia sort of kind of maybe escaped that for the moment, but things don't look good there either. But certainly, let's zero in on Libya. Certainly in Libya, Muammar Gaddafi, no choir boy, a dictatorial tyrant of a ruler of Libya, but he kept order in the place. Not only kept order, but he fought against the forces of the Muslim Brotherhood and Al-Qaeda, against the jihadi forces, even to the extent that the United States government released certain prisoners we had been holding in Guantanamo Bay at Gitmo back to Libya on the promise of Gaddafi that he would put them in his jails. They were Libyans. They could serve in jail in their own home country, but they'd be in jail. And Gaddafi did this. He had Al-Qaeda in his jails. Well, that went out the window with the Obama administration, and pressure on militia forces in Libya to rise up and to overthrow Gaddafi. These were Muslim Brotherhood in the political role. Under them, I mean chain of command under the Muslim Brotherhood, which were the political leadership in Libya, the Al-Qaeda militias. They overthrew Gaddafi October of 2011. And as we know, the place fell into utter chaos thereafter and has been in chaos ever since. Of course, the attack on our diplomatic mission in Benghazi in September of 2012 that took the lives of Ambassador Chris Stevens and 3 other American heroes, injured others severely. And onwards from that date, the place has been in utter chaos. Now, you may know that there are dueling armies at war in Libya now. After the overthrow of Gaddafi, the jihadi forces consolidated power in Tripoli, the capital of Libya, under what's called the Government of National Accord. That is recognized by the United Nations and the United States government. Opposing that jihadi government are the forces called the Libyan National Army under the leadership of General Khalifa Haftar. Haftar and his military are supported by Egypt and President al-Sisi of Egypt, also by Russia. Russia has a number of mercenary forces, specifically the Wagner Group, you may have heard of them, in Libya, fighting on the side of General Haftar. Well, he has made a lot of advances from the east of the country, close to the Egyptian border, advancing all the way westward to Tripoli, which lies towards the west, and besieging certainly the airport, excuse me, in the municipal area of Tripoli. Well, that's all to set the stage for what I wanted to tell you. And that is that beginning last fall, or late 2019, President Erdogan of Turkey sent over 4,000 troops, fighters, jihadi fighters from the battlefields of Syria to support the jihadi militias that are holding out against General Haftar. Now, it is not just the Libyan people who are suffering with this endless civil strife that we're thinking about, although we are. And it is not only the situation in the region, which certainly is causing ripple effects across North Africa and further out into the Sahel and westward. I want to cite King Abdullah of Jordan, who was speaking, I think, to the media in January this year, 2020. And he pointed out that the arrival of these additional jihadi fighters from the Syrian battlefields into Libya puts that many more jihadis and perhaps intending migrants closer to the launch point that many illegal migrants use Libya as a jumping off point because it is close across the Mediterranean to the southernmost parts of Italy. Now, with the coronavirus outbreak, and certainly in Italy, which is taking a hard hit, but elsewhere across Western Europe and Europe in general, borders have really been closed. I mean, in a way that they were not closed to the onslaught of millions, literally millions, of illegal migrants over the last how many number of years. Those borders now have really shut tight. Schengen Accord, forget about it. So the concern, I think, of King Abdullah of Jordan is real, that putting these jihadis, and certainly the Islamic State, has threatened openly to cede the migrant flow northward into Europe with jihadi fighters, putting them ever closer to the crossing points over to Italy is a dangerous development. The closing of the borders, may forestall some of that, at least for the time being. But I just wanted to mention the really malign influence, the malign activity of the Turkish government, our NATO ally, or ally no more, in taking actions directly opposed to the national security interests and the NATO alliance interests of our Western countries. So let me stop there with Turkey and finish up with the last topic that I want to bring to us tonight, and that has to do with something I talked about before, and that is the Russia-Saudi Arabia oil price war. Now, as we noted, I think perhaps it was last week, there were negotiations going on among the OPEC and also non-OPEC oil producers for some time. That would include Russia, include Saudi Arabia, other countries, because demand had fallen off. Now, in the first instance, that demand fell off because of the United States oil fracking and shale oil extraction revolution. And thank you, President Donald Trump, for additionally lifting onerous regulations that stifled those new technologies and the application of those new technologies, to the point where the United States now is essentially, together with natural gas, energy independent. Okay. Now, obviously, our coming online with hundreds of thousands of barrels of oil, we're going to talk about oil particularly here today, per day, barrels of oil per day, upset the pre-existing OPEC and other agreements about production levels and the relationship between production levels, global production levels, and pricing. And in particular, this hit Russia. Russia doesn't make that much. They don't export that much. They export oil, natural gas, weapons, and maybe some other natural resources, but not a whole lot else. The Russian economy depends to a great extent on being able to earn foreign income from the export of oil and natural gas. And the US coming on stream with all of this new production of oil really upset that. So the OPEC countries had been in negotiations about reducing production. In other words, if there is less production, what happens? The price goes up, right? And that was the intent, not to raise prices in any dramatic fashion, but rather to try to hold prices steady, because the prices were falling with all the extra product coming online. The Kremlin very openly talked about countering or trying to destroy, I mean, really, literally trying to destroy the US fracking industry. Putin, President Vladimir Putin of Russia, and other officials openly spoke about trying to shut down the US fracking industry, shale oil extraction industry. Now, I just published a piece recently, within the last couple of days, called Russia-Saudi Oil Price War, a Silver Lining for the US and Allies. And this is on the Drudge report under Laura Loomer's column, her blog site there. And so what I wanted to point out in this article, which again you can find at the Drudge report, Russia-Saudi Oil Price War, a Silver Lining for the US and Allies. The Russians were going along with these negotiations to cut production, thereby holding prices steady, up until the beginning of March. Now, for whatever reason, at the beginning of March, beginning of this month, 2020, the Russians all of a sudden said, nope, we're not doing this anymore. End of negotiations. We quit. We're not doing this. Now, let me just insert here very quickly that the Saudis, the other major OPEC member, had not come out openly and expressed any sort of desire to shut down US fracking and shale oil extraction. Yes, it was a competition for their own production, but I don't think many people know this, and I didn't know it either a week ago, and that is that the Saudis actually have a deal, a commercial deal with Halliburton, a US company, to collaborate on fracking technology. The Saudis wanted to work with us on fracking technology. So quite a different approach than Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin took. So early March, the Russians just basically said, end of we're not doing this. We're not cutting production. They rarely, if ever, have in the past anyway. We're not doing that. We're not going to cut production. We want to preserve market share. I guess the Russians, Moscow was afraid, cutting production, they would lose market share to those who might still be producing, like the United States, and they were unwilling to cede that market share to anyone else. And then a couple of other things happened that really pushed the Russians, I guess, over the edge. And part of that had to do with Venezuela. Now, in early March, again, 2020, President Trump levied sanctions against Rosneft. Rosneft is a very large Russian oil-producing company. US levied sanctions against Rosneft because Rosneft continued to do dealing with Venezuela and the regime of Nicolás Maduro in Caracas, Venezuela. And they are under sanctions. Venezuela, Maduro, under sanctions. And Russia just would not cut off the trade, which was in oil. It was oil trade with Venezuela to help out Maduro and keep him in power. So President Trump levied sanctions, very reasonable. But then the Russians pulled out of the negotiations. And what happened then is that the Saudis said, okay, Russians, you are no longer going to be engaged in these negotiations, which have just now collapsed. There is no agreement among the oil producing companies, OPEC, non-OPEC, altogether. There's no agreement. You Russians have just basically thrown a monkey wrench into our whole effort to cut production a little bit. 1.5 million barrels a day, I think, was the number proposed, to prop up prices. So President Vladimir Putin, says MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, son of King Salman, he said, okay, if that's the way it's going to be, then we, the Saudis, will begin extra production. We will ramp up our production and we will issue discounts.
Claire,
we will cut prices. Yeah.
I need you to move your screen up a little bit. It tilted.
Oops, I see what you're saying. Oh,
Thank
sorry
you.
about that. Oops, oops, oops. So the Saudis immediately took steps to increase production and also to drop prices, to offer discounts on oil. And they've held to that. Now, what it's become is an oil price war, and each, the Saudis and the Russians, are trying to hold onto their market share. And each of them, Riyadh and Moscow, thinks they can make the other one blink first. Now, both of these countries, Russia and Saudi Arabia, have massive financial reserves, somewhere in the range of, I think it's something like $500 billion in reserves, each one. They will both be required to dip into their reserves to maintain this oil price war, as long as they do. But each thinks they can make the other blink first. Now, in the midst of all this, because of lower demand, we said already because of fracking and the United States shale oil production, but now additionally because of the coronavirus and drastically reduced demand for oil and natural gas too, and other energy products across the entire world, the break-even point for either Russia or Saudi Arabia, and it is coming very close to the price point, break-even point, even for United States oil producers, drillers, rig operators, and so forth. Here, let me conclude, because this oil price war is ongoing. It has not let up. Let me just add the last couple of developments. I'll talk about the silver lining, and then we'll go to questions. So I talked about those sanctions that President Trump has levied, certainly against Venezuela and the regime of Nicolas Maduro, new sanctions as of this month earlier against the Russian oil production company Rosneft, because they kept dealing with Maduro. Well, at the end of March, just a few days ago, 25th of March to be precise, the Trump administration actually charged Nicolas Maduro, the president of Venezuela, with heading up a narco-trafficking cartel called the Cartel of the Suns, and charged that cartel with trafficking cocaine into the United States. And then the Trump administration offered a reward of $15 million for information leading to the arrest of President Nicolas Maduro of Venezuela. Now that really got the attention, well, of those who are not glued 24/7 to coronavirus, but this is a really significant development. And I really wanted to highlight it because it really takes another step against the Maduro regime, another step of pressure to bring down that regime. And certainly we know that that regime has been facilitating the trafficking of cocaine, by the way, with the full, complete participation of Hezbollah. Yes, Hezbollah, the Iranian Lebanese Shiite terror proxy, deeply involved in the cocaine trade out of Colombia through Venezuela and on up through Central America and all the way to cooperation with the Mexican drug cartels, and then the trafficking within the United States and Canada too. So those are the latest developments. Now, let me get to the silver lining, which I do outline in this article of mine at the Drudge Report, Russia-Saudi oil price war. And here's the silver lining, right? So while the Saudis have a very ambitious domestic spending plan, MBS's Vision 2030, for domestic development, for diversification away from purely extractive industries of oil and petroleum products. The Russians are dependent on their oil income for a lot of other things, to include foreign adventurism, as in propping up the genocidal regime of Bashar al-Assad in Damascus. And so the Russians are going to have to cut back on some of that, on the production of weapons, the production, domestic production of weapons, and spending money on the Russian military. So it's a difference in what they're going to have to cut back on. The Saudis will have to take a hit and cut back on their domestic spending plan, postpone certain projects related to Vision 2030, but the Russians will have to cut back on their attempts to export power and influence so far from Russia, that is, to the Middle East. And I think that's a positive coming out of all this. The Israeli Defense Forces, a spokesman for the IDF, just within the last week or so, commented on their observation that there's been a decrease in enemy activities aimed against Israel in recent weeks in the region. Now, they didn't say specifically Iran or Hezbollah, but that's basically what they meant. And that ties into the entire Russia, Iran, Hezbollah operation to prop up Bashar al-Assad. As well, Iran, which is working hand in glove with the Russians and supported by the Russians. Iranian regime, the Islamic Republic of Iran regime, is facing for a long time now, more than 2 years, serious domestic unrest, only exacerbated by recent events, meaning the COVID-19 pandemic that is taking so many Iranian lives, dilapidated, destroyed health system in that country, corruption, massive corruption, the imposition of US sanctions on the Iranian regime, of course, that following the United States Trump decision to pull out of the Iranian nuclear deal back in May of 2018. And since then, the sanctions have just become tougher and tougher. That's taken a real toll on the Iranian economy. They're really at the point now of having to decide, do we continue to prop up our terror proxies like Bashar al-Assad, like Hezbollah, like Hamas, or cut back on payments to them? Russia can't help anymore. Cut back on those payments just to hold the regime together, keep the regime in power. The place is falling apart in Iran. Much sympathy goes to the Iranian people who are suffering terribly in terms of economics. Poverty is widespread. Healthcare is abysmal. But now it's affecting the regime itself and its ability to wage war, project terrorism throughout the region and further abroad. We talked about Hezbollah in the Western Hemisphere here too, right? With the loss of Qasem Soleimani, the former commander of the Quds Force, who oversaw so much of the Islamic Republic's malign activities and terror support activities throughout the region, with the loss of Soleimani, his successor, Ghani, is not up to the task. I mean, thankfully so, right? But with all of these challenges is what I want to get at. Iran is going to be forced, is observably, reportedly already being forced to cut back. So this is what I mean when I talk about a possible silver lining for the United States, for our ally Israel, and others with whom we partner in the region as a result of the Saudi-Russia oil price war. And I haven't even mentioned, maybe I should, prices at the pump for all of us. There are possible negative consequences if oil per barrel, prices per barrel fall lower. Negative consequences for US producers, yes. But in the long run, we've got the reserves. We've got the companies, we've got the ingenuity, the technological ability. We will come back. But in the meantime, if the Islamic Republic of Iran and if Russian malign activities, support of terror in the region of the Middle East and elsewhere is diminished, that's the silver lining I'm talking about. All right, let me stop there. Let me conclude there and welcome any questions that you might have. Thank you.
Wow, great presentation, Claire, as always, full of a lot of information and a lot of categories that you covered. We've got people asking a lot about the COVID-19 and what you started with. So you mentioned that you thought it was a biowarfare attack, and I'm right there on board with you as well and believe that to be true as well. And keep thinking that maybe Trump needs to consider, you know, he's got a new Space Force that he's very proud of. Well, I think he needs to create a bioforce, wouldn't you say?
Well, I certainly do believe that this was a bioengineered coronavirus. I believe that at the Chinese one and only, well, declared anyway, biosafety level 4 institute, the Wuhan Institute of Virology, laboratory for lab work on the whole family of coronaviruses. I believe it was there that this particular novel coronavirus, COVID-19, was manipulated, genetically modified. I don't know if it got out on purpose or not on purpose, but if it were on purpose, it's certainly right in keeping with the 1999 book you may all be aware of, written by two Chinese PLA, People's Liberation Army colonels, called Unrestricted Warfare. But let that be an open matter for debate at the moment about whether it was deliberate release or not. I do think it was deliberately genetically modified. But the United States absolutely has agencies and organizations whose job it is to monitor things like this and to take steps. Now, obviously, no steps have been taken against the Wuhan Virology Institute. I don't know if it's the Space Force that needs to do that, but certainly places like USAMRIID, that would be the our own Virology Institute inside of Fort Detrick in Maryland. Also, National Institutes of Health and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention Atlanta, all of these would be engaged in, number one, determining, first of all, whether this virus was indeed bioengineered, genetically modified. I think it was genetically modified to enhance transmissibility, contagiousness. First, to find that out, and then to recommend what steps ought to be taken. There must be a lot of realignment of relationship, our relationship, others' relationships with China after this is all done.
Agreed. And there's been a question on what we can do to put pressure on China and try and look at the wet markets that are out there across probably China and other Asian areas that need to be looked at, and whether or not there's ways to shut those down. Absolutely.
China in the past had shut down some of these so-called wet markets. They're called that because they're live animal markets, where live animals are slaughtered on site, and then the meat sold to customers. That's why they're called wet markets. They had shut them down previously, but then they allowed them to reopen. And yes, they do exist in some forums in other East Asian countries. Yes, those have to be shut down. This would be a responsibility of the World Health Organization. Unfortunately, the WHO has been, at least in my opinion, far too willing to align itself with the Communist Party regime in Beijing. The steps that need to be taken, I think, will include things that are already happening. And number one, for the United States, that means bringing home manufacturing and production of critical national security items, products, and absolutely that's got to include from now on pharmaceuticals and medical supplies.
Absolutely.
There's nothing wrong with outsourcing some of that to some places, but not to a regime like China's that is our declared enemy. Right. So that's already happening just because of necessity and because American companies are seeing the market opportunities for doing so. So I think we're going to see a lot more of that.
Okay, we've got one talking about an order that Trump, last Friday, on March 27th, he signed an order to activate 1 million military reservists for a period of 2 years. Any information on that, and what's going on with that?
Well, I mean, for example, we see the enlisting, if you will, of the two U.S. Navy ships, the U.S. Navy ship Comfort and the other one, the Mercy, as we said, going to Los Angeles port, going to New York City port. That is, an enlistment of U.S. military forces to aid and support in this crisis. I suspect the 2-year mark is simply an outer limit of a period of time, so that it doesn't have to be renewed every 6 weeks or something. But those military have to do no with the institution of martial law. As I said before, just please back away from the blogs on that sort of misinformation, but rather to supply assistance like those naval ships, or like other things which have to do with transport, or maybe the use, the dipping into stockpiles of US government medical supplies and the like.
Well, this might be from a blog. I'm not sure. I don't think I've heard this, but somebody's asking about where Trump is seizing the Federal Reserve and taking control of it.
Yeah, this is what I talked about towards the very beginning of this evening's presentation, and that is that what President Trump has done is deploy and I'm no economist, so I hope I'm not misstating anything here, but this is my wording, my impression of what he's been doing. President Trump has been working with the US Treasury Department and in collaboration with the Federal Reserve and the central banking system in ways to provide loan guarantees, to provide liquidity, to provide cash. A common term for it might be printing money to insert into the US economy at this time of need when the federal government has told people to stay home, don't go to work, don't produce, don't make anything, has taken the responsibility to make up for some of that lost salary. So injecting liquidity, injecting cash into the economy, but that's in collaboration or collaboration between the Treasury Department and the Federal Reserve, but in a way that really puts the federal government in a very strong position, if not outright control per se, of the Federal Reserve system, of the banking system. And in return, and I'm not so sure, I'm of divided mind, and again, I'm no economist. I barely got through economics in grad school, barely. I think I got a C. The decision to take an equity position, for example, in the airlines, which are getting huge infusions of cash, is a decision that the president has made. This is related to his, we might think of, and here again comes my call for vigilance, the assertion of federal control over the private capitalist free market system.
Okay, do you know anything about the UN Resolution 5 that apparently, what this questioner is asking, wants us to cede our sovereignty to an international organization to standardize healthcare regarding pandemics?
Well, certainly the United Nations and of course the World Health Organization, the WHO, which is a part of the United Nations, wants to move in this direction. But I really have to applaud our President Trump because he's aware of this. I think he's wary of this. He, again, as I said at the beginning here tonight, he is the strongest champion of national sovereignty this country has had in a very long time. And he knows what the United Nations wants to do, and he is on guard against that. He's not going to cede US sovereignty or decision-making to the United Nations or any other internationalist, globalist agenda.
Well, you know, you've talked about President Trump not stepping over the boundaries of taking over and declaring closures of every state, but there are, I think, some governors and some mayors that just might be tripping over that edge and really putting out too many closures and too many demands, and actually putting out phone numbers for people to call to report on their neighbors. It's getting pretty bad in terms of that, in terms of this.
Exactly. And this is what I mean, again, about citizen vigilance. Again, it is within the authority of the state governors to regulate movement, traffic, quarantine, lockdown within their states. But yes, absolutely, when you've got a mayor of Orleans, you know, wanting to ban the sale, possession, transfer of ownership of firearms, you know, that oversteps the constitutional line for sure. Again, the difference at the federal level is between states, but within the states, absolutely, I agree. Some of these hardcore leftist, dare I say, communist, Marxist mayors and others are definitely overstepping the boundaries of the Constitution. And this is where we, the people, citizens, have to be very vigilant.
Do you see any concerns with collapse in terms of the printing of money?
I certainly see us way, way beyond any rational, reasonable limits of federal debt. I don't even know what it is anymore, 24, 25, 26 trillion dollars with the new bill that just passed. That's way beyond anything that any of us ever dreamed of. We understand why the most recent bill was passed into law and signed into law by the president. We understand a crisis the likes of which we have never ever seen in this country before, a nationwide, a worldwide pandemic of a deadly disease that is killing people by the thousands. Okay, but we have really got to talk to our representatives in Congress at some point when this is passed about that debt ceiling. We cannot just continue printing money, or we're going to enter a period of absolutely runaway inflation, and then watch out. Right now, inflation is very, very low. But with this and afterwards, we need to watch out.
Well, that's the last of the questions and comments. We really appreciate all that you've given us tonight. A lot to think about, and we're going to look forward to seeing you come back. I don't remember what the date is now, but I know you're going to be coming back here shortly and giving us new stories as well. So thank you for everything tonight, Claire. We really appreciate it. Great job.
Thank you. Thank Sharia Crime Stoppers and Dick Manaseri, United West, and the whole team there, and all of you listening and watching as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody. And we have Raymond Ibrahim coming up tomorrow. So please join us tomorrow. And then Dick will tell you all about what's coming after that. We appreciate you joining us tonight, and have a great evening. Good night, everybody.